Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Cool Shul Jewish Cultural Community, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. I've spent much of my adult life reconnecting to my youth, to the simpler days of organizing baseball cards, collecting comic books, watching hours of cartoons, staging stories with action figures, and of course, playing video games. Nostalgia used to be classified as a disease, with doctors calling it an unhealthy preoccupation, a harmful form of arrested development, and even an immigrant psychosis. But nostalgia ain't what it used to be. Researchers have found that people who indulge in nostalgia tend to be happier and more optimistic about the future. Perhaps that's why nostalgia is such big business, as today's guest knows well.
We're happy to chat with Larry Kuperman, Director of Business Development at Nightdive Studios, which acquires, updates, and re-releases classic video games for modern platforms. Previously, he was Business Development Manager at GameStop, where he acquired new PC game titles for the company's electronic software distribution platform. Larry, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Good evening. How is everybody doing tonight?
Pretty good, thanks for asking. So, Nightdive Studios restores, develops, and publishes classic video games. You have more than 100 titles across multiple digital platforms. What goes into obtaining the rights to these old games, dusting them off, updating them, and making them available to modern players?
Well, thanks. That's a great question. It always starts with detective work. You have to identify who the rights holder or holders may be for the game, and then once you've established that and found their willingness to work with you, then comes the contract phase. And yes, I do spend a lot of time working with lawyers. Once we've acquired the rights to a title and we begin working on it, the next question is, do we have the source code? If we don't have the source code, a whole process of reverse engineering begins, and that's very detail-oriented, but kind of also boring to talk about. Assuming that we do have the source code, we begin almost a one-to-one correspondence of porting it over from its old engine to our modern engine that supports all the current game platforms like PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and S and Nintendo Switch and all of that. The work that's done there is done by our developers and artists. And let me just give you an example. One of the games that we have announced for next year is Star Wars Dark Forces Remastered. And there were many videos in that, iconic videos. Well, those videos have not aged well, and they wouldn't look great on current systems. So one of our artists has been reworking them in higher res format, literally going frame by frame and upraising the work. And before anyone asks, no, we don't use any AI. All of the work is done by human beings. So we go through that. And then once we have a build that's been ported into our engine, we begin the process of testing and refinement. And it's an iterative process, but we're finally end up with a game that's of the quality standards that we hope for.
Are these kind of shots in the dark, or do you look for properties that you know are going to be popular with a fan base?
We look for not just games that are going to be popular, but we're big believers in games as art. And if you will allow me that games are in fact art, then that art should be preserved. So Nightdive's mission, and the reason that we're called that, is that we want people to understand that what we do is we bring back forgotten treasures like a diver would from the depths. And so we bring back games that our focus is always on games that are going to be significant. Those tend to be games that will do best monetarily. But even beyond that, we'll bring back titles that are truly niche, that only have a small following, but that deserve to be preserved nonetheless because they were influential.
Just wondering, are there any connections you see between republishing old literature and republishing old video games?
Norman Spinrad, science fiction writer, went to Bronx High School of Science, which is where I went. He found out that the only way that people could obtain his books digitally was through piracy. That his publisher had never seen the value in them, but the pirate sites had scanned them in OCR, done that sites, and we're now allowing people to download his work, and he wasn't making a penny off of it. So Norman went back to the publisher and said, I want my stuff out there digitally. And they said, well, we just don't see the investment. He says, I'll give you the digital copies. He downloaded them from the pirate sites and gave them to his publisher. I just love that story for so many reasons. One, this is what we call a Yiddish account. Okay, he took something that was working against him and made it work in his favor, and then the other part that goes with it is the audacity, to call up your publisher and say you're doing it wrong. Only 13% of games that were made more than 10 years ago are available anymore. 87% of the games that were made 10 years ago are gone. The old Atari infamously buried cassettes, cartridges of the games. And it's really unfortunate because the reborn Atari is coming out with a 2600 plus that's either out now or soon. And they make them look like the old ones, but with modern tech. Without a handful of companies like this, the games would disappear. And I remember back in my GameStop days, when I began, selling games, we used to have a debate of whether a title that was, when I would talk to the EAs and the Activisions, whether we should refer to a title that was made several years ago as old or classic. It's a mindset thing. We do not necessarily view video games as being the art that they are. The Atari again, it's completely different people involved in the company, but the Atari people that buried games in the desert, that in the trash heap, they didn't see anything wrong with that. If you said these pictures have been in the Met for a while, I mean, nobody's interested in this Mona Lisa stuff. It's old, you can't compare that to the new stuff that's out there, and took truckloads of art and buried it, we would be outraged by that. But when it was video games, we thought it was cute because, after all, how long would this last? It reminds me of something. Everybody knows the song "My Generation" by The Who. They asked Pete Townsend not so many years ago about the lyric "Hope I die before I grow old," whether that was still valid for him. And Pete thought about it a minute and then said, "Nah." I kind of feel the same way. There's so many things from our past that deserve to be preserved, that deserve to be, in some cases, reborn.
So the first home video game system was developed by Ralph H. Baer, a Jewish inventor who fled Germany as a teenager in 1938, just 2 months before Kristallnacht. In the mid-60s, he came up with the brown box, which was the blueprint for the original home video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey. I know you also teach about American Jewish history and culture. Have you done any research into the Jewish history of video games?
Absolutely, absolutely, and into Ralph Baer in particular. Ralph's story is really interesting. The brown box, the first prototype of a video console, is on display at the Smithsonian, and you can see how that early prototype would go on to influence the first generation of commercial devices. Baer is quoted as saying, "The minute we played ping pong, we knew we had a product. Before then, we weren't too sure." And that was in 1967 when the brown box was first unveiled. By 1972, Atari would launch Pong, which is widely regarded as the first commercially successful game. Baer's story, beyond his life story, beyond his great invention there, is also interesting, and it also shows, it really reflects on what the Jewish American experience was. So as you said, he came over, fled Germany right before Kristallnacht, comes over to the United States. As a young man, he was working in factories, and then one day he saw an ad for a learning program to become an electrical technician, which was something that was kind of unheard of, was rare in those days. So he went and he did that. He worked in the electronics industry, and then World War II comes along. And at that point, because of his background in electronic engineering, he's assigned to military intelligence, serving at the American headquarters in London. After the war, he uses his GI Bill benefits to get a bachelor's degree in what was called at the time television engineering, which is a really cool name, especially if you realize that television was just in its infancy at that time. So when I look at Bear's life and I take a look at the components of it, I see so much that is reflective of our entire Jewish American experience. His coming over and his advancing himself through education, his joining the military. I don't know whether you guys are aware of it, but at the time of World War II, there were about 5 million Jews in the United States, and 500,000 of them served in the military during World War II. So higher percentage than any other ethnic group. And then with his GI Bill benefits, he's able to get a college degree and then goes on to do these amazing things. And it just really goes to show how integrated we are in the American experience and how much the coming to America impacted the way we think of Jews today.
Yeah, and I still play Pong, and it still holds up. It's like it's simple, but it's so elegant and beautiful. And in my humble view, it's still the best video game out there.
One thing we didn't mention was that my company was acquired by Atari. We completed that back in May, and so Pong is very much a part of our DNA. Atari just worked with Google. They did a game day thing where they had various games that you would recognize from your youth playing off against one another to come to what is the greatest game. And of course, the answer was the greatest game was Pong.
One of your recent successes has been remastering and reimagining System Shock, a first-person cyberpunk horror sci-fi game set in a multi-level space station. The game was originally released in 1994. I know you spoke about this a little bit, but could you take us through the process of resurrecting System Shock?
Well, so when I joined Nightdive about a year after the company had first opened, so I joined in 2014. My first task was to acquire the remaining rights to System Shock. Steve Kick, the founder of Nightdive, had a, you should excuse the expression, epiphany while he was taking a travel break, that there was no legitimate way to play one of the greatest games of all time, System Shock 2. Steve reached out. He did a lot of that aforementioned detective work. He found out that the rights had ended up with an insurance company, contacted the insurance company, and they said, "Oh, you want to make a sequel?" He said, "No, actually, I want to republish the original." And if you believe the timing is everything, that was certainly the case, because they had just filed trademark on the game. And in order for you to complete the trademark, you have to demonstrate commercial usage. And lo and behold, into their lap fell somebody that at low cost and with a rapid time frame was going to enable them to demonstrate commercial usage. So he acquired those rights, but that was only the tip of the iceberg. And I began a process that took me over a year to acquire the remaining rights. Once we had those rights in hand, we launched a Kickstarter project, one of the most successful ones. We raised about $1.35 million from 21,000 backers. We anticipated at the time that the game would be out in about a year and a half, and within the budget of what we had raised. Fools that we were. It ended up to fulfill the vision that we had for the game. It took us 7 years and quite a lot of our own money to do that. But the game came out, and it has been very successful. Excellent reviews. Our fan base and our players are very satisfied with it, and on that basis, we really feel like our investment bore fruit.
Turning a little more to you, Larry, what is your own history of gaming? Were you an enthusiast before getting into the business side of things?
Absolutely. I've been in the business for 23 years, but this is not my first career. Back in 1991, I played Wolfenstein 3D. And I remember having a visceral moment. I remember when it clicked for me that the hand holding the gun was my hand. So it turns out the hand holding the gun was actually based on a hand model who I would get to work with later on in life. But when I found out that the protagonist in Wolfenstein 3D is a Polish Jewish soldier, I was hooked. And it in the strange past, of course, Wolfenstein 3D and other classic games were made by id Software, that's now part of Bethesda, part of the ZeniMax family of companies. acquired by Microsoft. So I guess, there are multiple tiers there. Most recently, we've worked with id Software on recreating Doom 64, which was a version of Doom that was previously only available on the N64 console system, something that no one has anymore. And then after that, based on the success of that, we redid Quake. And then just recently, we released Quake 2. And again, those have been some of the most successful titles and beloved by fans that we've ever done.
Looking through your catalog, I was intrigued to find a game based on legendary Jewish New Wave speculative fiction author Harlen Ellison's short story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. That game, by the same name, originally came out in 1995 and became legally unavailable due to a closure of the developer and publisher. And Harlen Ellison, who also co-designed the game, was, as I'm sure you know, notoriously cantankerous. And he was still alive when the game came out. I don't know if you had any interactions with Harlen.
I did not personally, but I will tell you some things about that. However, my partner and the founder of Nightdive Studios, Stephen Kick, not only worked directly with Harlen, but did an interview with Harlen that's still available on the internet. By the time I came in, Harlen's health was failing. And I worked with his attorney. We had several contract renewals that were, how should I put this, a bit unorthodox. Harlen was very much in need of some financial help, and we were able to do that. We were able to provide that for him, and I'd like to think that we were able to make his last days a little bit easier.
Certainly a legend. Good to hear that he was directly involved with that.
A little bit of an anecdote about that. Harlen actually had a box of copies, had boxed copies of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, cluttering up his garage. And when we said we could find a home for them, he was only too happy to get his garage back. And so, I'm not really a big collector, but I do have a Harlen signed box copy of the game.
As Jonathan alluded to, you teach about Jewish history and culture. One of the topics you've explored is Jewish humor. How do you define Jewish humor, and do you have a favorite Jewish joke?
So Jewish humor, first of all, that's a dangerous question to ask, not just me, but any Jew, because we all have our favorite jokes. But Jewish humor is what has sustained us through 2,000 years of travail. And I was surprised in my research to find that our forebearers in shtetl days, in the Pale of Settlement, told jokes that have a very modern sensibility that you would not have been surprised for a Mort Saul or Lenny Bruce to tell. And skipping the dark ones, let me tell you one of my favorite shtetl jokes. This was translated from the Russian, so forgive me if it's a little bit broken, but a man tells a joke to a peasant, and the peasant laughs 3 times. Once when the joke is told to him, once when the joke is explained to him, and then again when he finally gets it. Jew tells the man tells the same joke to a landlord, and the landlord laughs twice. Once when the joke is told to him, and once when the joke is explained to him, but he never actually gets it. Tells the joke to a policeman, and the policeman only laughs once. When the joke is told to him, he never lets the man explain it to him, and he never gets it. Man tells the same joke to a Jewish friend, and the Jewish friend interrupts him when he's halfway through and says, "Excuse me, but I've heard the joke before, and to tell you the truth, I tell it better." So that's from our ancient past. The one that I've always enjoyed in the modern vernacular is a father calls up his son, and he says, "Son, sit down. I have some bad news for you. Mama and I are getting divorced." The son says, "Getting divorced? You've been married for 45 years. The father says, "Yes, 45 years of misery. It's enough. We're getting divorced." The son begins to freak out. He says, "Listen, let me call my sister. We'll call you back." Calls him back. Says, "Dad, it's almost Passover. Don't do anything rash. Wait for us. We'll come out. We'll bring the children out. We'll have Seder meal together. We'll enjoy a Pesach, and we'll see if we can't figure this out." The father says, "Well, I don't know, but okay, we'll try." Hangs up. Looks at his wife and says, "Yeah, that worked, but we'll have to figure something different out for next year."
Nice.
You're also involved with the nonprofit organization Beyond Barriers USA. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, Beyond Barriers is a very important organization. It was founded by two former members of the National Socialist Association, two former neo-Nazis, who now work in one way or another for the Wiesenthal Institute, and they're two of the best people that I've ever met. One of the things that's challenging for Jews in the modern age is we're really good at talking to each other and not so good at talking outside, talking to the groups that we need to reach. And so Beyond Barriers kind of fills that need. Surprisingly, to many people, I have done classes on Jewish history. My first lecture for them was on Chaim Solomon, the hero of the American Revolutionary War. And you might be surprised, but people that have been in extremist movements, once the door opens a crack, they become so interested in learning about things that they had not known about before. And having somebody that will talk to them on a one-to-one level, that won't begin by saying, you're terrible and I hate you, but that will talk to them on a factual basis. They absorb it like a sponge. And so it's been a wonderful experience for me, and I believe it's part of Tikkun Olam.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's next for Nightdive?
Well, we've announced Turok 3 that will be coming out later this year. That's the capstone of the Turok trilogy of games that were originally based on the Gold Key comic book series, Turok Son of Stone. We also will be releasing next year Star Wars Dark Forces, that game. We have 5 other games currently in one phase or another of production. And so it's a busy time for us. And I'm excited about some of the titles coming out.
Sounds good. We'll definitely keep track of that. And thank you, Larry, for joining us.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful experience, and I'm glad to speak to your audience.
Well, thank you. And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.